The US ambassador to the United Nations has warned that Russia is now threatening to invade Sweden and Finland. Speaking to the General Assembly, she said this.
President Putin continues to escalate, putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening to invade Finland and Sweden. At every step of the war, Russia has betrayed the United Nations. Russia's actions go against everything this body stands for. People across the world have already united together in exactly the way this General Assembly must do today.
As far as we know, Russia hasn't explicitly threatened to invade Sweden or Finland, but they have been fairly threatening. In response to speculation that Finland could join NATO, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted this to social media. It's a quote from their spokesperson. "We regard the Finnish government's commitment to a military non-alignment policy as an important factor in ensuring security and stability in Northern Europe." And then the tweet says, "Finland's accession to NATO would have serious military and political repercussions." So those military repercussions there is what seems so threatening. At the beginning of February, Putin also sent letters to the two countries demanding security guarantees which neither country has so far given him. This all, of course, sounds fairly familiar. After all, it's exactly the story that led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yet there are differences. Unlike Ukraine, both are already members of the EU and so benefit from the European defence commitments. Unlike Ukraine, neither country has ever expressed a strong interest in joining NATO. That's until now. Deutsche Welle report that support for joining the military alliance has surged in both countries. In 2017, only 19% of Finns wanted to join NATO. That's now gone up to 53%. In 2017, 32% of Swedes wanted to join NATO. That's gone up to 41%. In both countries, a majority against joining NATO has turned into a majority for joining. Aaron, Putin would often say that his biggest gripe with Ukraine was that it might join NATO, and he was very opposed to the eastern expansion of NATO. Has this maneuver, from his perspective, really backfired because now everyone wants to be part of NATO, or even these countries that have ruled it out beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, more ridiculous, I think, are calls for Ireland to join NATO and Switzerland. And you think Switzerland's been neutral, I think, 500 years. I don't know the exact numbers, but I mean, the very essence of the Swiss nation is neutrality. With regards to Finland, where the polling shifted the most, I mean, given the size of their land border, given the history they have with Russia, I think it's entirely reasonable. I personally, I'm a skeptic of NATO because of what's happened in Libya, what's happened in Afghanistan, because of the very roots of it after the Second World War. I think even if you supported NATO after the end of the USSR, it was an organization in search of a role. And what I haven't really had explained to me is, if Europe needs a form of collective defense against the Russian Federation, which I think Ukraine would indicate that's true, and I buy that, I don't quite get why it has to be NATO. Surely the argument then is for an independent European defence force, European army. You've got two nuclear powers in Europe, Britain and France, high levels of technological sophistication, massive military contractors and defence companies in Finmeccanica in Italy. You've got Saab in Sweden, German companies, British companies, French companies, Spanish companies. So this idea of NATO, I think it's almost like it's kind of like a very strange argument that people were having 30, 40, 50 years ago. I think clearly there needs to be a collective security arrangements for Europe. Of course there do, given what's happening. The idea that it's going to be based on the United States entering what would have to be World War III, like the next major war that NATO is involved in would be World War III. I don't quite understand why that's the default of the conversation. Sweden's a bit different. I mean, the polling hasn't shifted there as much. A plurality want to join NATO, but not a majority, which suggests it's kind of more open to debate. I don't believe they have a border with Russia. Norway does. It's already a member, tiny border up in the north near Murmansk. Finland, as I've said, has a huge border. Sweden doesn't. It would have to be invaded through the north, relatively small landmass compared to Finland. And it has 200 years of neutrality behind it, Sweden. So Sweden, I would be surprised if they joined NATO. Finland, I have to say, if I was Finnish, I'd certainly understand the arguments. But for me now, Michael, if you're seeing the Germans talk about increasing defense spending to 2% of GDP, et cetera, surely that's the moment then to generate a conversation around what a European army looks like. I'm not saying I support that. I'm just saying it seems a more sensible approach, and maybe that's an appendage to NATO. But surely that seems like a more sensible approach than saying there's this military alliance which existed since 1945, and it involves the North Americans, and that's how we talk about defence in, Northeast Europe. I find that a bit strange, but I'm happy to be corrected.
The point about why we have to tie up with America is quite interesting, especially considering that Donald Trump could be president in 2 years' time. So it seems like 2 years ago, everyone was saying Europe needs complete independence from NATO because America is governed by a madman. Now, 2 years into Biden's rule, everyone seems to have suddenly forgotten that happened and assumed it won't happen again. We'll come back to this. I do want to go through some details about Sweden and Finland because they are, as Aaron has suggested, very interesting countries in terms of defence. Finland shares a 1,340-kilometre border with Russia and has maintained a powerful army for the 80 years since the two countries last went to war. Its active military personnel stands at 280,000. That's 30,000 larger than Ukraine's. And universal male conscription holds. So basically half the population are trained combatants. Sweden, on the other hand, has maintained neutrality for over 200 years, but since 2014, it too has been investing heavily in its military following a number of Russian incursions into its territory. In 2018, tensions with Russia were so high that the Swedish government sent a pamphlet to every household with guidance about what to do in the event of a war. So far, though, Sweden's Prime Minister has been clear that membership is not on the table, saying Sweden has been alliance-free for an extremely long time. It has served Sweden's interest well. So you can see there the demand, and actually apparently Reuters have come out with a poll which shows that there is now actually 51% support for Sweden. It seems to be changing every day or going up every day. I suppose these threats from Vladimir Putin are probably helping the people who want the country to join NATO. There's almost like a bottom-up demand now, it seems. It's the electorates that want to join NATO instead of the leaders. What do you make of that? Would you persuade people against that? I mean, this invasion of Ukraine, the extent of it, it does make you think, I still am critical of NATO's eastern expansion. I think that the West should have tried to integrate Russia into its military infrastructure and security infrastructure rather than sort of build up a big defense against it. But at the same time, if you're in Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, you're thinking, God, thank God we joined NATO when we did.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right, Michael. I think the question about why couldn't Russia join NATO in the mid-1990s, and the answer was, of course, well, the whole point of NATO is it's set up against Russia. Well, if there are no conditions under which it can join, then it's going to naturally understand others joining it as a hostile act, because it literally can't join this club, which therefore means that the basis of that club is to defend against Russia. Obviously, at that point, Russia was incredibly weak. 1998, Russia was getting food aid, right? That's how broken it was by sort of shock doctrine market reforms we had over the 1990s. So I do sympathise with them, Michael. And I have to say, somebody sitting down in Britain, we've got nuclear weapons, we're an island. It would be very strange to say to a Finn, looking at all of this, saying, "Oh no, you don't need to join NATO." Because if I was a Finn, I would, I think, reasonably be concerned that what's going on in Ukraine could happen to my country. I think that's a reasonable concern. I think it's likely, and that's reflected in, not everybody wants to join NATO in Finland, but I think it's a reasonable concern. And I think how this plays out, look, if there's a peace negotiation next week and Russia leaves and it just goes to Donetsk and Luhansk and there's a neutral Ukraine, maybe that's going to inflect the debate somewhat. I think the worse things get in Ukraine, then I think the more the public in Finland in particular will move and harden towards a pro-NATO position. So I totally get it. And Finnish politics, the Finnish government is very much on the left. Sanna Marin, young left-wing prime minister, the left controls the government there, very progressive. I'm not saying they're sort of right-wing sellouts. What I would say though, Michael, is what Finns also have to bear in mind is if they join NATO, when Libya is bombed and you get open-air slave markets as a result, and a collapse in living standards, and warlords and gangs running the country, remember that you're implicated in that. So there's a trade-off there. And of course, NATO hasn't done what it's meant to do for so long. And so it had these kind of escapades in Afghanistan and Libya. Afghanistan and Libya are nowhere near the North Atlantic, Michael. I would say that to our listeners and our viewers look at a map, it can tell you NATO's gone awry if that's the missions it's undertaking. Clearly, this is what NATO's for, however, a defense against Russian aggression. I think some of the arguments which have been made as well prior to the war, us included, were highly rational, based on realpolitik, based upon, well, Russia is only going to be interested in maximizing its rational self-interest, right? And I think we have to suspend that presumption for a while and be open to the possibility that actually Putin and the role of Russian ultranationalism and the role of a quote-unquote civilizational ideology is far more central here than perhaps material interests. I mean, otherwise what he's doing, Michael, is entirely inexplicable. And so given that, I think it is probably quite reasonable for Eastern Europe in particular. When I say Eastern Europe, I'm including Germany, which is increasing defense spending, but Poland, Finland, I can understand why they'd want to harden their relations towards Russia. You also had, of course, news of Moldova wanting to join the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. I think these are all rational, explicable things. I just think there's a big downside if you're from these countries and you don't want to be involved in the next Libya or Afghanistan.